Ridge Trail had a reputation among the park rangers. It wasn't the steep incline, the sharp turns, or even the occasional bear sightings that made it unnerving. It was the silence. Unlike the other trails in the park, where birdsong and rustling leaves filled the air, Ridge Trail was eerily quiet, even during the day. Some said it was the dense trees blocking the wind, others joked it was cursed. But no one could deny the unsettling feeling of walking that path alone. I was assigned to patrol Ridge Trail one evening after a pair of hikers reported strange activity. They mentioned hearing footsteps behind them, steady and deliberate, yet every time they turned, no one was there. The woman had laughed it off, but her partner seemed genuinely spooked. I chalked it up to paranoia and maybe a trick of the echoing trail, but protocol demanded an inspection, so I grabbed my gear and set out just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The trailhead was already bathed in shadows when I arrived, the last rays of sunlight slipping behind the treetops. The air was cool, and a faint mist clung to the ground, giving the area an ethereal quality. I adjusted my flashlight, its beam cutting through the encroaching darkness, and began my hike. The first mile was uneventful. The trail wound upward, bordered by tall pines whose needles blanketed the ground, muffling my footsteps. I paused occasionally to listen, hearing nothing but the faint hum of distant insects. But as I climbed higher, the air seemed to grow heavier, and that unnatural silence settled around me. It was at the second mile marker that I heard it, the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was an echo of my own steps, but the rhythm was off. My stride was steady, but these steps were slower, deliberate, and just out of sync with mine. I stopped abruptly, and so did the footsteps. I turned, shining my flashlight down the path I had just climbed. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. The silence pressed against me, and I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Taking a deep breath, I called out, "Is someone there? This is Ranger Cole. If you're lost, I can help." My voice sounded hollow in the quiet, and there was no reply. I waited a moment, my hand instinctively resting on the radio clipped to my belt. Then, I heard the steps again, closer this time. They weren't hurried, but each step seemed purposeful, as if whoever or whatever was making them wanted me to know they were there. My flashlight wavered slightly as I scanned the trees, my pulse quickening. There was nothing visible, yet the sound persisted, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the trail, but seemed to echo from all around me, the trees amplifying the noise in a disorienting way. I called into my radio, my voice steadier than I felt. "Base, this is Ranger Cole. I'm on Ridge Trail 2 miles in, hearing something. Possible trespasser, requesting backup." The response was garbled static, the signal too weak in the dense forest. I cursed under my breath and decided to push forward. Whatever was out there, I told myself, was probably an animal, or at worst, a hiker messing around. But the unease in my chest told a different story. As I continued, the footsteps seemed to follow, matching my pace but staying just out of sight. I quickened my steps, my boots crunching against the gravel, and the footsteps mirrored me. The faster I walked, the louder they became. I finally broke into a jog, adrenaline coursing through me, and the footsteps followed suit, heavier now, almost like something was running right behind me. When I reached a bend in the trail, I spun around, flashlight raised. The beam cut through the mist and landed on a shape, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the middle of the trail. It was human-like but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally stiff. Its face was obscured, but its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, glowing faintly in the dark. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, as if the forest itself were recoiling from its presence. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed at me. The motion was deliberate, almost accusatory. Panic overtook me, and I turned and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly as I sprinted down the trail. The footsteps thundered behind me, faster and heavier, as if whatever was chasing me was closing the distance. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together in my peripheral vision. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the trailhead, I stumbled into the clearing near my truck, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped abruptly, the silence returning as if nothing had happened. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but the figure was gone. I filed my report the next morning, leaving out the parts I couldn't explain. Ridge Trail has always been quiet, but now I know why. Whatever walks that path after dark isn't human, and it's not alone. The abandoned cabin sat deep within the forest, a relic of a bygone era when loggers worked the surrounding woods. Its roof sagged under the weight of decades, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and creeping vines. Most rangers avoided it, citing superstition or simply the eerie atmosphere that surrounded it. But as the newest ranger at Hollow Pine Reserve, I wasn't one to entertain ghost stories. When the report came in of strange noises near the cabin, I volunteered to investigate. The trek out was long, the path narrow and overgrown. Twilight was settling over the forest by the time I arrived, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. The structure looked even more decrepit than I'd imagined, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes. As I approached, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, leaving only the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I called out, "Anyone here?" "Park ranger." My voice echoed off the trees, but there was no response. I circled the cabin, shining my flashlight along the rotted walls. The back door hung crooked on its hinges, barely attached. It creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single-room interior coated in dust and cobwebs. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the expected disarray of an abandoned building. But as I moved further inside, I noticed something strange. The floorboards were scuffed, as though someone had been pacing back and forth. In one corner, a pile of objects caught my eye. Rusted tools, shards of broken glass, and what looked like an old journal. I picked up the journal carefully, its cover brittle and flaking, and flipped through its yellowed pages. The entries were dated decades ago, written in a hurried scrawl. They described strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows moving outside the windows, and the feeling of being watched. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. It knows I'm here. It won't let me leave. A sudden sound made me freeze. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but unmistakable. My flashlight darted to the door, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. The cabin seemed to hum with tension, the air growing colder. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. They were indistinct, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every corner of the cabin. My heart pounded as I spun around, searching for the source. The flashlight's beam trembled in my hand, illuminating empty space. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they began, replaced by a low, guttural sound. It came from beneath the floor. I backed away, my breathing shallow, and trained the flashlight on the floorboards. One of them was loose, tilted at an odd angle. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I knelt down and pried it up. The space beneath the floor was shallow, just a crawl space. But what I saw made my stomach lurch. Bones. Dozens of them, human and animal alike, scattered haphazardly among the dirt. And in the center of the space was something else. A crude carving, etched into the earth. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, jagged and angular, pulsing faintly as though alive. A sudden thud behind me made me spin around. The front door, which had been partially ajar, was now wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Beyond it, the forest was pitch black, the trees shrouded in a thick fog that hadn't been there before. My flashlight flickered, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I bolted for the door, slamming into the frame as I stumbled outside. The fog was dense, swirling unnaturally around the cabin. The whispers followed me, blending into what sounded like laughter. Low, guttural, and mocking. I ran, not caring about the path or the branches tearing at my uniform. The forest seemed endless, the trail back to the station eluding me at every turn. Finally, I burst into a clearing and saw the faint glow of the station lights in the distance. I didn't stop running until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. My supervisor looked up from his desk, startled. "What happened to you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were still trembling as I dropped the flashlight onto the counter and sat down, my mind racing. I tried to explain, to describe what I'd seen, but the words felt hollow. How do you tell someone about whispers in an empty cabin or a symbol that pulsed with life? The next day, I returned to the site with a team. The cabin was still there, just as decrepit as before, but the loose floorboard was back in place, and the crawl space was empty. No bones. No symbol. The journal I'd taken was gone. The others dismissed it as stress, a trick of the mind brought on by isolation. But I know what I saw. Something lingers in that cabin, something old and malevolent, and it's waiting for anyone foolish enough to disturb its slumber. Hollow Creek was one of the most secluded parts of the park, hidden deep within miles of dense forest. Few visitors ever made it that far, and those who did often left with uneasy stories, unexplained noises, missing gear, or a feeling of being watched. As a park ranger, I'd heard the tales plenty of times, but I chalked them up to overactive imaginations and the natural disorientation of the wilderness. That was until I had my own encounter. It started with a report of strange activity near the creek. A group of campers had abandoned their site, leaving everything behind: tents, supplies, even their car keys. They stumbled into the ranger station just after dawn, pale and shaking. One of them, a man named Greg, claimed they had been stalked all night by something large and silent. He described hearing heavy footsteps that circled their camp, but never revealed the source. Then came the growling, low, guttural, and close. It wasn't an animal, Greg insisted. It knew we were there. It was watching. I volunteered to investigate. Hollow Creek was about 2 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail. I set out just before sunset, equipped with a flashlight, my radio, and a sidearm for protection. The woods were quiet as I walked, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. Even the birds were silent. When I reached the campsite, it was just as the campers had described, completely intact, as if they had left in a hurry. Their tents were zipped shut, a half-cooked meal still in a pot over the extinguished fire. The only thing out of place was a series of deep gouges in the dirt around the perimeter of the site. They looked like claw marks, long and deliberate, but there were no animal tracks nearby. That's when I noticed the smell, a sharp, metallic tang, like blood mixed with something rotting. I called it in, describing the scene to the station. "I'm going to do a quick sweep of the area," I said into the radio. "Might be a bear or a cougar, but something doesn't feel right." The sun was sinking fast, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I moved toward the creek, the temperature seemed to drop. The air grew thick, heavy, and the smell became stronger. The creek itself was a narrow, winding stream that cut through the trees like a vein. Its water was dark, reflecting the twilight sky. I scanned the area with my flashlight, searching for signs of movement. Then I heard it, a splash, followed by a low, guttural growl. My heart pounded as I swung the beam of light toward the sound. The water rippled, but there was nothing there. I called out, "Park Service! If anyone's out here, make yourself known." No response, just the faint rustling of leaves. I stepped closer to the edge of the creek, my boots sinking into the muddy bank. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were huge, twice the size of a human foot, with clawed toes that dug deep into the mud. They led from the water's edge into the trees. I followed the tracks, every nerve in my body on edge. The growling came again, louder this time, and I froze. It was close. Too close. The trees around me seemed to shift, their branches creaking in the windless night. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something tall and hunched, slipping between the trunks. The growling turned into a roar, a deafening sound that shook the ground beneath me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight swinging wildly, and then I saw it. The creature was massive, its body covered in matted fur that gleamed wetly in the light. Its limbs were long and grotesque, ending in hands that looked almost human, but with claws like daggers. Its face was the worst, a twisted, nightmarish thing with glowing yellow eyes and a mouth full of jagged teeth. It stared at me, its head cocked as if curious, and then it took a step forward. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the creature's roars echoing behind me. My radio crackled to life, but I didn't stop to respond. The trees seemed endless, the darkness closing in around me as I sprinted back toward the campsite. When I reached the clearing, the creature was gone, but the silence was deafening. The gouges in the dirt seemed fresher now, as if it had returned while I was gone. I radioed the station, my voice shaking as I relayed what I had seen. Backup arrived an hour later, but the creature was nowhere to be found. The footprints by the creek had vanished, and the smell had dissipated. My colleagues chalked it up to a bear or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but I knew better. Something lives in Hollow Creek, something ancient and territorial. It watches from the shadows, waiting for those foolish enough to venture too far. And while I survived my encounter, I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back. The call came in late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the towering peaks of Black Ridge National Park. A lone hiker, John Mercer, had failed to return from a trail that should have taken no more than 4 hours to complete. His girlfriend, Sarah, had reported him missing, saying they had argued earlier in the day, and John had stormed off to hike alone. He hadn't returned, and she was worried. I'd been a park ranger for nearly a decade and knew the trails well. The route John had taken was straightforward but isolated, winding through dense woods and skirting the edges of steep cliffs. It wasn't unusual for hikers to lose track of time, but with darkness approaching, I had to act fast. I set out with my gear, the fading light casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above, but there was an unnatural stillness to the woods. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, leaving only the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. About an hour into the search, I found the first clue. A water bottle lay discarded on the side of the trail, its cap missing. Nearby, the dirt was disturbed, as if someone had stumbled. I called out John's name, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. I radioed back to the station, reporting the find, and continued deeper into the forest. As the trail narrowed, the canopy above thickened, blocking out what little light remained. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. That's when I heard it, a faint, raspy voice calling out from the direction of the cliffs. "Help! Someone! Help me!" The voice was weak, barely audible, but unmistakably human. I quickened my pace, calling back, "John? Is that you? I'm a park ranger. Keep talking so I can find you." The voice didn't respond directly, but repeated the plea for help. It sounded strained, as though whoever it was could barely speak. I followed the sound, leaving the main trail and pushing through the underbrush. The ground became uneven, the rocky terrain sloping toward the cliffs. Finally, I reached a small clearing at the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to a sheer drop overlooking the valley below. The last rays of sunlight bathed the area in a soft, golden glow. There, sitting on the ground near the cliff's edge, was John Mercer. His clothes were torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt. He looked up at me with wide, glassy eyes. "You're going to be okay," I said, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" John didn't answer right away. He stared past me toward the forest, his breathing shallow and ragged. His lips moved, forming words so faint I had to lean in to hear them. They followed me," he whispered. "From the trees. They don't let you leave." A chill ran down my spine. "Who followed you, John? Did you see someone?" He nodded weakly, his gaze darting around as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Not people. Not human. They're watching." Before I could press him further, he suddenly grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Don't look into their eyes," he said, his voice trembling. "They take you if you look." I tried to reassure him, telling him we'd get him back safely, but his grip slackened, and his head lolled forward. He was unconscious. I radioed for a medical team, giving them my location and describing John's condition. They told me it would take at least 30 minutes to reach me. As I waited, the forest grew darker, the twilight giving way to night. The breeze had stopped entirely, and the silence felt oppressive. I sat next to John, keeping my flashlight trained on the woods. Every so often I thought I saw movement, shadows flickering between the trees, but when I focused on them, there was nothing there. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a hiss coming from the forest. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept the beam over the trees. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, coalescing into shapes that lingered just out of reach. The air grew colder, and the uneasy feeling of being watched became unbearable. John stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open. He grabbed my sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "They're here." I turned back to the forest, and my flashlight caught something. Eyes. Dozens of them glowing faintly in the darkness, watching from between the trees. They didn't blink or move, just stared, unblinking and full of malice. The growling sound grew louder, reverberating through the clearing. I hoisted John onto my shoulders, my heart pounding as I made my way back toward the trail. The glowing eyes followed, moving parallel to us but never getting closer. The growls turned to whispers, a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak directly into my mind, though I couldn't understand the words. Finally, the headlights of the medical team's vehicle appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. As I reached them, the whispers stopped, and the glowing eyes vanished, leaving only the empty forest behind. John survived, but he never spoke of what happened again. Whatever he encountered in the forest remains a mystery, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never forget his final warning. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood, and once they see you, they never stop watching. The fog rolled in like it always did, thick and unrelenting, blanketing Silver Point National Forest in a suffocating gray. Locals called it the endless fog, a phenomenon that persisted over the northern stretch of the park, regardless of the season. Scientists attributed it to the unique topography and humidity, but for those who spent time in the area, there was a far darker theory. The fog never lifted because something didn't want it to. I was assigned to patrol the northern trails one afternoon, after a pair of hikers reported hearing strange noises in the fog. They claimed to have heard whispers and what sounded like faint footsteps behind them, though they never saw anyone. These kinds of complaints weren't unusual, but they were unsettling. I knew the fog played tricks on the mind. Shapes seemed to shift in the gray haze, and every sound felt amplified and close. Still, protocol demanded a ranger investigate any reports, so I geared up and headed out. By the time I reached the northern boundary, the fog was already thicker than I expected. The usual landmarks, trail markers, tree clusters, even large boulders, were barely visible. The silence was deafening. No rustling leaves, no bird calls, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as if the forest itself had been swallowed by the mist. I called out as I walked. "This is Ranger Beck. If anyone's out here and needs assistance, call back." My voice sounded foreign in the fog, absorbed by the dense air and swallowed before it could echo. I moved deeper into the trail, my flashlight barely piercing the haze. Every so often I paused to listen, straining to hear anything that might indicate someone was nearby. That's when I noticed it. The fog wasn't just thick, it felt alive. It moved unnaturally, curling and shifting as if reacting to my presence. I shook off the thought, blaming my overactive imagination. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Hello? Is someone there?" The whisper came again, more distinct this time, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded close, yet no matter where I shone the light, there was nothing but trees and fog. My pulse quickened as I continued forward, the trail barely discernible underfoot. About a mile in, I found something that made my blood run cold. A backpack lay abandoned by the side of the trail, its contents spilled onto the ground as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. Nearby, the dirt was disturbed, deep grooves marking the ground as though someone had been dragged. I knelt to examine the scene, my breath fogging in the cold air. The grooves led off the trail and into the woods. I radioed the station. "This is Ranger Beck. I've found an abandoned pack and signs of a struggle on the northern trail. I'm following the tracks." The response came back garbled, the signal distorted by the dense fog. "Copy, careful, back up." I caught enough to understand I wasn't alone, but the static only added to my unease. Still, I couldn't ignore the tracks. Someone was out here, and they might be in serious trouble. I stepped off the trail, the fog growing thicker with every step. The grooves in the dirt led deeper into the forest, winding around trees and through dense underbrush. The whispers grew louder as I followed, overlapping and chaotic, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. The path led me to a clearing I didn't recognize, even though I thought I knew the forest like the back of my hand. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone, its surface covered in strange, weathered carvings, symbols and patterns I couldn't begin to understand. Around the stone, the ground was bare, the dirt smooth and untouched by plants or debris. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, tall and thin, its body shrouded in tattered gray that blended seamlessly with the mist. It moved slowly, almost floating, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I shone my flashlight on it, but the beam seemed to pass through its form, illuminating nothing but fog. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and the figure turned its head toward me. Its face, or what should have been its face, was empty, a featureless void that seemed to pull at my thoughts, dragging them into the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice was weak and trembling. The figure didn't stop. It glided closer, the fog swirling around it like tendrils, reaching out as if alive. I ran. I didn't care about the tracks or the stone or the whispers. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted back toward the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The whispers followed, growing fainter as I finally broke through to the clearer air of the southern boundary. When I reached the ranger station, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. A search team was sent out the next morning, but they found nothing. No pack, no stone, no tracks. Just endless fog. I never patrolled the northern trails again. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't something natural, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to see again. The fog still lingers there, thick and unyielding, and I can't help but wonder what it's hiding, or what it's waiting for. The forest of Pine Hollow was famous for its dense trees and haunting beauty. The towering pines, their trunks weathered and scarred by time, seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. As a park ranger assigned to this vast wilderness, I had grown used to the isolation, the eerie quiet, and the stories whispered by visitors and locals alike. But none of those stories prepared me for the night I heard the voices beneath the pines. It began on a quiet evening. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that clings to your skin and leaves you uneasy. I was patrolling a lesser-used trail, one that snaked deep into the forest and rarely saw visitors. The sun had set hours ago, and the only light came from my flashlight, its beam cutting through the thick shadows of the trees. The silence was unnerving. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of wildlife, just my footsteps crunching on the trail. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree and scanning the area. That's when I heard it. At first it was faint, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. A voice distant and fragmented, like someone calling out. I strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, carried away by the breeze. My hand tightened around the flashlight as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The voice didn't answer, but it didn't stop either. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was alive with whispers. They were overlapping, tangled in a chaotic murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The voices weren't loud, but they were persistent, their tone pleading and mournful. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, stepping off the trail and into the thick underbrush. The voices grew louder as I moved deeper into the forest, their tone shifting from pleading to something more urgent, almost desperate. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, shaking it to keep the light steady. As I pushed through the trees, I stumbled into a small clearing. The ground here was soft, the dirt damp and loose. My flashlight illuminated the scene, and my breath caught in my throat. The clearing was filled with shallow holes, each one about the size of a grave. Some were freshly dug, the soil still loose, while others were partially collapsed, overgrown with moss and grass. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient pine, its massive trunk scarred with strange, jagged symbols carved deep into the bark. The voices were louder here, clearer. They seemed to rise from the ground itself, seeping up from the earth like mist. I crouched down, shining my flashlight into one of the holes. It was empty, but the dirt was stained dark, as if something had bled into the soil. My chest tightened with unease. I stood quickly, my flashlight darting around the clearing. The whispers were growing more frantic now, almost angry. The symbols on the tree seemed to writhe in the beam of light as if alive. A sudden guttural sound made me spin around, and my flashlight caught movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its eyes glinted in the light, dark and reflective like an animal's. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, radiating a sense of dread that made my stomach churn. The whispers surged, a deafening chorus that drowned out every rational thought. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the damp ground. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, the clearing was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the forest in an oppressive silence. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I clutched the flashlight. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the forest itself was watching me. I didn't wait to see if the figure would return. I bolted back toward the trail, branches tearing at my uniform as I ran. The path seemed longer than before, the trees closing in around me. When I finally broke through the tree line and reached my truck, I collapsed against the door, gasping for air. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next day, but my account was met with skepticism. A search team was sent to the area, but they found no evidence of the clearing, no strange symbols, no shallow graves. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. To this day, I don't patrol that section of Pine Hollow. The memory of the voices and the figure in the shadows still lingers, a constant reminder that some places are not meant to be disturbed. The whispers beneath the pines were not just voices, they were a warning, and I pray I never hear them again. The map showed nothing unusual about the trail. It was an unmarked path, a short spur that split off from the main route in the northern part of the park. Some trails in Black Hollow Reserve were unofficial, created by wandering hikers over the years, and most eventually faded back into the wilderness. But this one was different. It stayed well-trodden, as if people couldn't help but walk it, even though it led to nothing. No scenic overlooks, no campsites, just a dense stretch of woods that swallowed anyone who ventured too far. As a park ranger, I prided myself on knowing every inch of Black Hollow, but I'd never heard of this trail until reports started trickling in. First, it was casual hikers mentioning a strange side path. Then, campers spoke of eerie feelings and unusual noises near the area. One woman claimed she'd walked it for hours and never reached an end, only to find herself back where she started, without turning around. The final straw was the disappearance of a man named Carter, a seasoned hiker whose wife reported him missing after he failed to return from a solo trip. His last known location? That unmarked trail. I was sent to investigate on a foggy afternoon, the kind of day where the sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy. The trailhead was easy to spot, marked only by a faint gap in the trees and the faint impressions of countless footsteps. The air felt different here, heavy and oppressive, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds, wind-rustling leaves, were absent. I adjusted my radio and stepped onto the path. The first half-mile was uneventful, though the deeper I went, the stranger the atmosphere became. The trail seemed almost too perfect, as if the dirt had been smoothed and maintained by unseen hands. There were no fallen branches, no overgrowth, nothing to suggest the wild chaos of nature. It felt artificial, yet there were no signs of human work, no markers, no clearings, no campsites. Just a straight, narrow path cutting through the forest. After an hour, I stopped and checked my GPS. The screen flickered, struggling to maintain a signal. The coordinates showed that I'd been walking in a straight line, but something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sensation that I'd been here before. The trees looked identical, their bark scarred with strange, jagged patterns that I hadn't noticed earlier. They almost looked like claw marks, but larger and deeper than any animal could make. I radioed the station, but the line crackled with static. "This is Ranger Hale," I said, my voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "I'm on the unmarked trail. GPS isn't functioning properly, and I've got no signal. Will update as I can." No response came. I clipped the radio back to my belt and kept walking. The path stretched endlessly before me, the trees pressing closer with every step. The air grew colder, and a faint mist began to creep along the ground. My flashlight barely penetrated the growing gloom, and shadows danced at the edge of my vision. Then I saw something that stopped me cold, a figure standing in the distance, motionless. It was barely visible through the fog, but its outline was unmistakable. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Are you lost? This is Ranger Hale. I'm here to help." The figure didn't move. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trained on the spot where it stood. But as I drew closer, the figure faded, disappearing into the mist as if it had never been there. I stopped, heart pounding, and scanned the area. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed foliage. Just the endless, featureless trail. I turned back, deciding it was time to leave. But after walking for what felt like another hour, I realized something was terribly wrong. The path hadn't changed. The same jagged markings scarred the trees, the same mist swirled at my feet, and the same eerie silence filled the air. Panic began to set in. I should have reached the trailhead by now, but it was as if the path had no end. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a whisper. It came from behind me, then to my left, then ahead. My flashlight flickered, and the mist thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I broke into a run, the sound growing louder, closer. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding as I stumbled over unseen roots. The growling stopped, replaced by faint, overlapping whispers. They were unintelligible, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. I shouted into the void, desperate to drown them out. But my voice was swallowed by the mist. Just as I felt I couldn't run any further, I stumbled into a clearing. The mist parted, and there it was, the trailhead. My truck was parked just beyond, a beacon of safety. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the fog. I never went back to that trail, and neither did anyone else. A week. I never went back to that trail, and neither did anyone else. A week later, it disappeared entirely, overgrown as if it had never existed. Carter was never found, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, wandering a path that had no beginning and no end. Whatever haunted that trail, it didn't want to be understood. It just wanted to keep anyone who dared to walk it, forever.